Professor, thank you very much for being here. I want to start with the title of your talk today. What are the faces of creativity?
Well, the faces of creativity are as numerous as there are human beings. I think that the real face of creativity is the face of individuality. There was a wonderful talk yesterday here at Fleepy about the brain and how the more brain scientists understand about the brain, the more mysterious phenomenon of human consciousness and personality becomes. This tremendous gap between the way neurons generate knowledge and awareness of the world and what we call who we are as an individual. The more they know, the less they understand.
In which basis are they settled? What is the relation between creative writing process and the country's national history?
Good question. The United States is essentially a Puritan culture to begin with, Protestant culture, in which work and utility is everything. And traditionally, art, poetry, even intellectual activity has not been valued in the United States. It's about industry, it's about power, it's about commerce. So artists in the United States, writers in the United States have always felt that they are working against the official culture and needing always to prove that what they do is valuable and to be recognized for it. And that's one reason we have creative writing programs, because these are places within academia where we're not being academic, we're not being critics or scholars, we're being artists, but in a place that values that. In Latin America, often you will find poets or writers being diplomats, never in the United States.
Really?
Yeah. So we have a very vital artistic culture, but it has always had to work against this priority of utility, something that has to have a use in society. And I think that's one reason popular art, whether it's the movies or rock and roll, is so strong in the United States, because that's art that makes money. But art that doesn't make money, poetry being one of those arts, it's always been difficult. But this difficulty has created some of the greatest poets who ever wrote in English.
So, as you said, it has always been difficult. How it can be improved?
Well, as I said, the creative writing programs didn't exist 50 years ago. It came from the 1960s, when there were fewer than 10 creative writing programs in universities in the United States, and there are now over 300. And the ability to, again, create a way to support art in the United States, it's been a tremendous effort. Beginning in the 60s, the private sector and the government got together and created a national endowment for the arts, councils for the arts. And this was a very deliberate effort. But it came from recognizing that in the 20th century, there were so many great artists, painters, writers, composers coming from America, and we began to value that. But it wasn't a natural part of American culture. To me, art is eternal. It is something that has existed in every human culture in every time. I mean, we look at the cave paintings. There was poetry before there was writing, before there was reading, before there were books. There was song. It is, again, when you say the faces of creativity, well, there are how many billion people on the planet right now. That's how many faces of creativity there are. The question is, how can they be seen and how can they be heard? And that's where I think you need to create an infrastructure for the arts. You need publishers, you need agents, you need ways of distributing art. But I think that the internet and digital technology has been the greatest gift poets have received in hundreds of years. Because suddenly you can disseminate poetry at no cost to millions of people. You couldn't do that when you had to take a book and publish it and get a bookstore to sell it, or a library.
And apart from poetry or writing, how this creative process can contribute to other fields, public sector and private as well?
Mm-hmm. There's no practical application. That's the important thing. The Mexican poet Octavio Paz said famously that poetry is the antidote to the marketplace. But he also said, if human beings forget poetry, they will forget being human. Because what business can do, what politics can do, what technology can do, is move things forward. It can enable us to eat and put houses over our heads and build tall buildings. But we can't make those things conscious. This is where I go back. The Greek philosopher Plato said that the eyes are the windows to the soul. Now, in contemporary science, they will say the eyes are the visible part of the brain. And when you look into someone's eyes, you are seeing their brain. You are seeing who they are and what they're thinking and what they're feeling in their eyes. You are seeing the brain. That's what art contributes. It contributes consciousness. So you have a tremendous mechanism called, the internet or business or political power, but it is there in the service of human consciousness, and it's only that way that we can understand what it is to be human and why we're here. And I do think that once we forget why we're here, why we want all this power and all this wealth and all this celebrity, we're not being human anymore. So what art contributes is humanity, which again, it's not one face, it's a billion, several billion faces.
Well, the global platforms and new business models means that talent, culture, and organization forms will have to be significantly retaught. Are we living a new era where the talent is the most important skill?
I do think that that's true. I don't work in the business field. I know a lot of people in the business field. And especially now, with everything going on with technology, this term, to find a technology that's disruptive, to be innovative, is to be creative. And certainly, it can't just be about having an assembly line where you turn out the same thing all the time. The impulse to be creative, to be innovative, yes, I think is probably more important now.
I brought this subject about because Klaus Schwab, the founder of World Economic Forum, was talking about the fourth industrial revolution. What is it and how to respond to the fourth revolution? He says very, very clear that talent is more important than the capital, than the physical thing. So creativity, empathy, and stewardship, he puts as the three main things for a successful professional nowadays. It can also lift humanity into a new collective and moral consciousness, as you just told us. Yeah. So this is the thing we should keep an eye on.
I mean, I agree, of course, with the way that he has said that. The word that jumps out at me as an artist is empathy, which is the ability to become someone else in your imagination. You can't write a novel without empathy because you are becoming other people and no longer yourself. The great English poet John Keats, writing about Shakespeare, said that Shakespeare's greatest quality, he called it negative capability, which was the ability to erase himself, to become a kind of chameleon and become other people. Once it becomes all about yourself, and you think of, it could be a political figure, it could be a celebrity, it could be or anyone, if they have no empathy, they've lost their creativity and they've lost their own humanity. So a business with no empathy is just a voracious animal with no brain. And yet the power of technology, of business, if it is connected to empathy, can do great things. Lincoln Center in New York City was a product of President Eisenhower in the 1950s sitting down with the Ford and Rockefeller foundations and saying, we have Rockefeller Center, which is a monument to capitalism, but what we want and need now is a Rockefeller Center of the arts, and that created Lincoln Center. That couldn't have been done by a group of artists, living in Brooklyn. It did take the power of industry and the power of the government to make that possible.
Can you see similarities between Brazil and the US in these terms?
Well, I'm learning a lot about Brazil here, and I've had a number of conversations that reflect, I don't think the issues are really so different, but I think the first impression for someone from the United States and coming to Brazil, it's what we imagine Brazil to be, is a beautiful place where beauty is valued, where there's tremendous sense of spirit and celebration and the pleasure of life. It's very different from the Puritan mentality. Yeah? And it's very true. I mean, there are things like this festival that I don't think could happen in the United States because we don't have the same natural relationship to beauty. However, this morning in the talk about Brazil, one of the speakers said that yes, there is this culture of celebration, but inside it, if you're Brazilian, you understand that there's a deep sadness and a disappointment, and that this is part of our nature, and said that so we celebrate our history, and we are very nationalistic, and then we're always tearing it down and trying to get rid of our history. And when I was in Sao Paulo and spoke with people there at the Cultural Center and talking about the explosive growth of Sao Paulo and the skyscrapers and all the energy it's taken to create all of this new stuff in such a short amount of time, and all the many people who moved to Sao Paulo. What I'm also hearing is that many people in Sao Paulo don't feel any connection to that city. They don't feel it's their community. They want to tear the big buildings down. And that is what I think I was talking about with Paz, that when we lose our sense of something being an expression of consciousness, as opposed to simply a blind production of things, then we're in trouble because we don't know where we're going and we don't know how to control it. The American poet T.S. Eliot wrote in a poem in 1950, and it was like a prophecy of the internet. He said, "Where is the wisdom that we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" Now, in 1995, we entered the age of information. He wrote that in 1950. And we all know that there is so much information out there that our individual human brains can barely keep up with it. And again, this is the answer to his questions is poetry. It's art. Because we have to find our way back to wisdom. Just like someone living in modern day Sao Paulo, or New York for that matter, has to find out where their home is. and they have to remember their history, and they have to keep their connection to a community, whatever their sense of community is. And again, that's where the faces of creativity come from. Once you have a blind blur of 20 million faces, there are no faces of creativity. They all look the same.
And that's why the quote, literature is news that stays news, so important.
Yeah, there's an even better one that's similar to that. That was from Ezra Pound, but William Carlos Williams, they were very close, said something in a poem very similar. He said, "You'll never get the news from poems, but men die miserably every day for lack of what is found in poems." Unless you have empathy, it doesn't matter how much you know. Unless people feel that their culture understands them and recognizes the importance of their individual existence, they will die miserably. And that's, I think the whole world is in danger of that right now. I mean, that is not just Brazil.
Yeah, we have a divided country right now, and people are showing their opinions in the social media, and we don't know where are you going, but people want to argue with each other without reading deeply the other side. So they are getting specialized in their opinions.
And it's a big danger in the United States right now, where you have people who want anyone who's a Muslim or anyone who's from Mexico, throw them out, keep them out. We only want people who look like us and are like us. It's the worst political tendency. However, to have this debate and recognize that there are these extreme disagreements is not necessarily a bad thing. The great Czech poet Miroslav Holub said, when the Soviet Union invaded Prague and they were under the thumb of the Soviets in the Czech, what is now the Czech Republic, he said, it's a very poetic situation. And I think poetry, it was like I was saying, the disagreement between poets and American culture, or artists in American culture, is what has generated great poetry. I think it's moments like this, when there's terrible anxiety, that creativity is most necessary. And often when what artists can contribute becomes most important. One more quote from the Irish poet Yeats. I told you earlier. He said, from the disagreement with other people, we make rhetoric. But from the disagreement in ourselves, with ourselves, we make poetry. I think in a moment like this, it's not just about arguing with the other person, it's recognizing, being able to recognize the argument inside oneself. I have teenage kids. They say they hate social media, and they are looking at their phones all the time. But they feel controlled by them. I mean, we are all every day dealing with these contradictions. We hate the internet. We hate social media. There's too much email. There's no time to read a book or paint a painting. And yet we're fascinated. We're there every day, spending hours and hours. So how do we turn that into something creative? How do we bring what was called the gray matter, or the white jelly of the brain, and it could be the mechanism inside the computer, together with consciousness? And I think only artists and creative people can answer that.
So studying humanities should be a thing that we value more.
I think nothing is more necessary. And it's a terrible threat now that universities, even universities, are being pressured to give up the humanities, to give up anything that doesn't have a practical purpose. This has been done in Japan recently, where they just removed the humanities from their college curriculum. But this is true even in science. Again, yesterday, scientist who is leaving Brazil was talking about how pure science, where there's no purpose, is how you produce knowledge. Applied science, engineering, is what you do once you have the knowledge and you find a practical purpose. But without the pure science, which I would also say is the poetry, you'll never have anything to apply. You won't have any knowledge, much less any wisdom. You'll just have information. White jelly.
So we should read more Yeats nowadays.
Everyone should read more, but I'm not making a big push for literature. I do think, again, what art is about is expressing individuality, the individual spirit, the individual sensibility. Why is it? I mean, you say, is art getting worse? No, because it will always be there. The more people there are, the more good art there will be, because it comes out of our being human. It's not artificial. So it's more about giving, whether they're children in kindergarten or students in a university or people in the workplace, giving them the opportunities to not be just like everyone else. That's what it's about. You don't have to read Greek, but you do have to have a sense that the imagination and the freedom that the imagination can give you is just as important as the rational brain that balances the checkbook. But again, I say that recognizing there needs to be an infrastructure. Here, I mean, I've been learning about the publishing industry in Brazil and how it's difficult for young artists to find agents, or writers to find agents, which in the United States, we have this wonderful opportunity for young writers because the agents want to bring on young writers. We have organizations that are publicly funded that distribute the books of little presses. I think, you know, finding a way between the public sector and the private sector to put these sorts of things together. It's like creating a public transportation system for art. That's important too.
Let's try. Thank you, William.
Thank you very much
that.
for
Thank
having
you.
me.